Good afternoon and most good morning, I should say. Most welcome to H710. We are early here, therefore I said the wrong greeting. I will not say the wrong pronoun, however. Today, it's actually quite interesting. When we had the last two lectures, it was a bit of an accident and I had to come up with a new subject, and all of a sudden we stranded into universals and nominalism. And I was not thinking to return to the subject, but when looking into the ideas of William James and the other pragmatists, I come to an understanding this is not a small matter, which I decided to name the lecture. I realize this fight between the universals and the nominalists is actually quite interesting. When I studied philosophy, it was just a little small part of the whole subject. But yesterday I remember that Wittgenstein actually put a lot of effort into this. And he did not join either camp. What he did was even more interesting. And also the father of psychology, William James, the American pragmatist, also had some very interesting views on this matter, because it's enlightening for many different things, goes to many areas. And it actually is one of those things that opens up for pragmatism, this special American type of philosophy that is very different from analytical philosophy. And one could say usually these three people are the most prominent of American pragmatism. Some people would say that it was C.S. Peirce who started it. Some say that William James was the biggest name in this area. And then we had, of course, John Dewey, which is the only one we already mentioned here. And the reason for that is that John Dewey actually took a keen interest in the Alexander technique. He made good friends with Frederick Matthias himself, and there was some sort of cross between Alexander technique and pragmatism. That was very interesting.
Cross-fertilization.
Cross-fertilization, thank you very much, Kalle. That's exactly the word I was looking for, actually. What I thought myself yesterday when I got into this is, with the universals, we tended to have an exaggerated focus on things at the expense of particular things. And when I heard this the first time many years ago, I was thinking that, how can I explain this? It was sort of, it was exactly as it was presented in the lecture, a sort of a fight between the universals, on one hand, the universalists and the nominalists on the other hand. But then I came to realize, because that fight is more or less over today, well, at least when you're studying philosophy in Sweden, it is one of those quaint subjects in philosophy you look into and you enjoy it, and maybe you have a cup of coffee and just chat over it, because it's sort of a subject that's cooled down. It won't lead to anybody throwing any frying pans, something that did actually happen at the philosophical institution.
But in Sweden it was universalists who won?
Well, I'm coming into now, because I was tricked myself somehow, because I think the general feeling at the lecture time was that it was a done battle, but more in the sense it was no longer interesting. So nobody really won. And therefore it was a cold subject, because there was no fighting going on, and we were supposed to write something, very little, and it was very hard to get any emotion into it or any energy to do it. But I was still thinking, how come William James was so interested in this? This was yesterday. And then I start thinking, this is one of the main subjects, actually, one reason for the later Wittgenstein. And then I realized I had a model in my head, because I seen this once before. It was a statue I saw in India many years ago. And it was a lion, and no, it was a tiger. Tiger was on top of a lion, and the lion was dying off somehow. And this statue actually had a message, a religious message, and it was, the tiger was Hinduism and the lion was Buddhism. And it was a slow overtake of the tigers from the lions. Lions used to be a thing in India, I think, yeah, somebody said to me. And it was never a regular fight where the Buddhists were driven out of India. It was more in the idea happening, the progressing of the ideas. And that's very hard to explain, but it's going to be easier to explain here. But something happened in India, and some artist felt it's apt to show this in this statue, process that took a very long time. And I'm going to start with the site before I go into the actual point. And this is a cite from William James himself. From every point of view, the overwhelming and portentous character ascribed to universals and their conceptions is surprising. Why? From Plato to Aristotle, philosophers had vied each other in scorn of the knowledge of the particular, and in adoration of that of the general. It's hard to understand, seeing that the more adorable knowledge ought to be that of the more adorable things, and that the things of worth are all concrete and singulars. The only value of universal characters is that they help us by reasoning to know new truths about individual things. And when I read that, it was, I wouldn't say it's clicked, but I came to an understanding. Those lectures in the 90s where the subject of universals and particulars didn't feel that interesting anymore. It was the tiger who devoured the lion, so to speak, that universals, without a fight, somehow devour the particulars. And then I started to understand what William James is saying here. He cannot understand the tendency not to get interested in the particulars. And I think the reason is, and I think he's hinting to that, that's what he felt. Well, we need to understand also he wrote this in the late 19th century. There has been a development further in the direction I would like to tell now. And it's that when I think of a particular, and when I did think of a particular in the 90s, I was actually thinking of a universal. I was thinking two things. I was thinking the general cup, in this case, teacup, and then I added another general property, and that was particular. And that's not the same thing, to be particular, because to be particular doesn't take any universal, neither cup nor being a teacup, or being general, or being particular. So what happened is, when we said particular, and the reason why this fight was more of a surrendering or giving up, never a proper fight that was settled once for all, because the fight was harsh in the Middle Ages, and it lingered on into the Renaissance. And I think you can still get some spot in Mill and Adam Smith and Hume, but it cooled down already then. It wasn't interesting, because we already started to perceive everything as generals, as universals. So even the particular had disappeared. And I think in the class that we were discussing, and somebody said this is absolutely boring or something like that, which is quite normal for analytical philosophy. And yeah, I was thinking to myself, yeah, this is quite uninteresting. But then it struck me, how come it was such a big fight for almost a millennia? I would say even more. Every time I think of a particular, I use the universals. It suddenly struck me, this is in action all the time. And this is what William James was pointing to. He was thinking reality as something bland without properties. Everything that is from the singular, the particular, had sort of disappeared. And the subject has become a devourer of objects only, but in a passive way. Let's start with Wittgenstein. He's the other character in this format. And we have free insight from philosophical investigations. The first one is, in most but not all cases, the meaning of a word is its usage. In most but not all cases, the meaning of the word is in its usage. The activity, number two, the activity of language is tied up with living. The act of living or being alive is similar to the activity of language. And the third one, there are no absolute rules of language to distinguish nonsense from sense. Within language, there are no inherent rules to tell if what I'm saying is nonsense or sense. For us to tell that, we need to be in reality. That's the only chance. There's nothing in language itself that can tell that. We are completely free to tell nonsense, and we are completely free to make sense. The first statement goes completely against universals, because universals are static. They are situated somewhere else in transcendency. They do not have to be in the world of ideas, but they are always at some sort of transcendency. They are not movable. They are objects in the sense of being very definitive nouns. And the second, the activity of language is tied up with living. It's a progression. So what we do in our life worlds is very connected to the activity of language. This shows even more that it's not only not static, it's also intentional. And universals are just out there. They don't have an intention. They are movable and non-intentional. Something that Ashish Dalela describes as numbers, objects, usually lack the description of meaning, which he proves is very important. Third, and this could be the most interesting, there are absolutely no rules of language to distinguish nonsense from sense. And that goes against the grain of analytical philosophy, for instance. They want to have rules within language that tell something is nonsense or something is sense. And there's actually a recommendation from Paul Austen, a little handbook. We actually got that one, and I hope we can make maybe a podcast with that, because it's so exaggerated and it's sort of meta rules for how to speak to make sense. Like it would be any rules for that. Austen doesn't think there is a reality. Therefore you need rules to say that if anything is nonsense or sense. I think that could be very interesting, and put it to the notes that such a podcast will be made, because it will be very interesting. And in the third rule, we can also observe sort of this passivity. And this passivity is, if we have rules to tell us if a sentence or a phrase or a statement is nonsense or sensible or makes meaning or is doable, that means I don't have to participate. It takes away my participation as a subject in the world. I don't have to be present. It's going in the direction of being automatic, because rules have this feeling of being automatic. And you could think, as something we mentioned before, the rules of physics. The idea is that there are automatic in the universe, a sort of fix all the physical laws, using mathematics usually. But that calculation is not in this universe. And where it is, nobody says. And that's the objection of Wittgenstein. There are no absolute rules of language to distinguish nonsense from sense. There are no rules in language. It's not an automatic process. It's not within language. You could say it's within language and world, or you could say it's within language and living. But it's not only in language. That's a misnomer. And one could say, I think it is so, and I myself suffered from this, and especially at that lecture so many years ago. And there's a desire not to actively participate in the happenings of the world. And then we prefer an automatic rule to tell us nonsense from sense. And this is actually a sort of lived determinism. You become choiceless. You do not need to be in the world. You can cut yourself out of the world, and you're hoping for this other thing to do the trick. This is very similar how Hilbert was hoping for mathematics to count out itself, that the rules for mathematics was inside mathematics. So everything would be automatic. You didn't have to have an intention. You didn't have to have a subject, observer, you name it. And that is a desire also from Hilbert, and was for me and for my co-students, that everything should be automaticated, deterministic. And that belief in determinism, I think that's part and parcel in classical physics. I think it's actually experienced of the people who claim classical physics is the model. You actually experience yourself as having no choice. It does not, however, mean that you don't have a choice. That's a whole other business. You cannot put a red card and say, I'm opting out of life. I'm no longer part of this. I don't have a choice. That is also a choice. So we could never be choiceless. And that's the point, of course, of the pragmatist. And then it rang a bell. We didn't have much classes of the pragmatist. They were seen as, somewhere in between people who you can trust, who are not trustworthy or not correct, but still interesting, because they opened up a whole school that is quite interesting, with Quine and Richard Rorty and several people in modern ages. We mentioned one the other day, Thomas Nagel. He's influenced by these tendencies, which are really, really interesting. And one understands a little bit better now why America needed another philosophy than the analytical philosophy. Yes, Derrida used to say, the United States is destruction. Deconstruction, of course. I was thinking too much of Trump. In that case, it would be correct to say America is destruction. And for our point of view, it's very interesting. It's a little bit that when we read about the pragmatists, that they were not caring about rules, like that rule I was mentioned here, determinism, and they were not being sufficiently serious. Nobody said that, but I got a feeling myself, actually from my inner. Nobody put those thoughts in my brain or those words in my mouth. But it's the difference between when you are in the analytical philosophy or where you are in ordinary society of Sweden, especially, maybe Europe as well, taking away France and Germany, or influenced by the continental philosophy, you automatically think that's not a serious project of William James. It's still interesting. You can use some of his stuff, and I remember I had a huge book of William James, and I liked it, but I thought some things were a bit spooky or weird, or that's not correct. It was not clear enough. I think this clarity I was looking for, I didn't find there. But I found a lot of other stuff. And I did understand that William James was highly intelligent, and he also had a way of going about words that was really killer. He could really kill off other arguments very effectively by speaking to sense and reasonableness. So, and now I understand better why I partly rejected William James. And I remember I got punished for that. I had to pay for the book. It was expensive. I did leave it at the library. I remember that. I never forgot that because it was a specific day. But I still had to pay for it. And I think that was karma. Not taking William James to the heart is well worth it. And I think all the pragmatists have something that is highly interesting. And I'm very glad that we all, by happenstance, it was a meeting that was cancelled, and all of a sudden this with Universal pops up out of the blue air. And I was thinking, why not? I turned out to be very interesting. Even this minute subject, it was like, I think it was 2 classes when I studied philosophy. Well, not even that. It was like 1 class. It does count. It's very important. So I finish off and say, these things about universals and particulars, it's not as small as one usually think. It's a bit more. Why, thank you very much. And now I can say, well, good morning again. Thank you.
Thank you.